If there's one thing that's been appearing a lot more as of late, it's the amount of re-releases, remakes, and remastered editions on new consoles both of the home and handheld variety. From The Last of Us and Gravity Rush, to Resident Evil 5 and Dead Island, to the recently announced Modern Warfare, these, shall we call them, Re-3, if not more prominent than they were in the 7th generation of gaming, certainly give the impression that they are in the 8th, and show no signs of stopping anytime soon. Even if they are needlessly tied to the newest Call of Duty, as a disgusting means of boosting the amount of pre-orders for Infinite Warfare. Even Atari is rumored to be releasing a 2-set volume containing their vast catalog of classics for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. If true, kinda makes you forget that Atari themselves prevented Jeff Minter from releasing TXK on other systems by threatening bull-filled claims of copyright infringement about Tepmis 2000. Oh wait, it doesn't. Also, I did mispronounce that. Atari couldn't even spell the name to their own game right. Twice! For whatever complaints may exist about publishers and developers re-releasing the same video games being due in some part to the lack of backwards compatibility on the PS4 and Xbox One with, as of this video, the majority of the respective predecessors' library of games, one of the good things to come of it is exposing a new audience to a game that may have been overlooked or that they were unable to play due to the choice of system in a previous generation, while simultaneously preserving the medium's history, and in some cases, improve upon the flaws of the original. Though, yeah, developers should be taking a more active role in preserving the earlier pieces of gaming history rather than the more recent ones. Which brings us to today's title, Odin Sphere. One of the later releases on the PlayStation 2, Vanillaware's Odin Sphere was a critical darling upon release that didn't see much commercial success, mostly due to being released after the PlayStation 3 launched during the previous year. Since then, it's become something of a cult classic, with Vanillaware and Atlas giving the game a second chance with Odin Sphere Leifthrasir on the PlayStation 3 and 4, along with the Vita. So, does this remaster for one of the PlayStation 2 swan songs see a successful rebirth? Or is it a tragedy of the highest order? Let's find out. The story has a fairly interesting setup to it. It's split up into 5 smaller stories centered around various characters, with each of them being connected around a cauldron that wiped out an entire kingdom and a ring that can reactivate it and control its massive power, both of which play a part in a prophecy that sees the entire world destroyed in Armageddon, all of which is read to the player by a little girl. The first story is about a Valkyrie named Gwendolyn, who aims to please her father by fighting for him alongside her sister, only for said sister to be killed by enemy forces led by a knight in black armor, the irony being that this same man would eventually be the one she later falls in love with. Aside from a predictable twist concerning the character of Velvet and, in the 6th book, the identity of the Blue Bird, it's a decent tale on its own that sets up the major pieces to be moved around on the board with each successive story, albeit the romance is poorly handled. By which I mean there isn't any to speak of. Gwendolyn swiftly turns from hating the man who previously fought her allies to venturing through the netherworld itself, fighting for his very freedom to live, over the course of a few days. Yet over said course, Oswald does next to nothing to get Gwen to change her mind about him, let alone become infatuated with him to the point where she'd willingly betray her father to save him, given how much of the story is focused on trying to earn her father's love. Not to mention that the most romantic thing that her lover-to-be does is give her a ring. Ah, materialism. The true way to a woman's heart. One might bring up that, given the person reading the story is a young girl, what we're seeing is a simple fairy tale, the kind one would tell to their kids before tucking them into bed like The Princess and the Pea, and thus the lack of chemistry can be attributed to the simplicity of storytelling on display, were it not for A, revelation in a later part that takes away any magical element this romance may have had prior to it, and B, Odin Sphere is aiming more for tragedy than it is for fairy tale territory. In addition to copying the names from various figures in Norse mythology, like Odin and Yggdrasil, the plot shares a lot of similarities with said sagas. In particular, Ragnarok with its prophesized end to the world. If there's one thing that can be said about the pursuit of romance and relationships within those epics, it's that they weren't lacking in detail, often going into far too much of it with the romantic betrayals characters would go through. Even within Odin Sphere itself, the other pairings are much better handled and far more developed than Gwendolyn's and Oswald's, such as the one in the 2nd story. It's about a chivalrous prince named Cornelius who's in love with a princess of a kingdom that no longer exists, whose father disapproves of the romance that eventually gets turned into a puka, basically a bipedal rabbit, and waking up in the netherworld. Of all the main stories, this is the one which feels the most divorced from the main path, though ultimately it works out for the best. The mystery surrounding the transformation may not be particularly thrilling as the main thrust of the story, but Cornelius' noble nature is smartly contrasted with the often cruel land and caste that occupies it, making for an engaging adventure with an empathetic lead. Even if they are voiced by the same person who played Yosuke in Persona 4.
What do you suggest I do?
Shut up, Yosuke. The third one is about a fairy named Mercedes who, after the death of her mother, assumes the title of queen. Of the 5 main tales, it's easily the best of the bunch, striking a more personal chord as Mercedes struggles to accept her new duties as ruler, while her cousin Melvin schemes to become king himself, all while the threat of the Demon Lord and his Baylor looms over her domain as Odin seeks the cauldron's power and the ring that activates it. It shows a different side to what seemed like naked aggression in the first story, while being a genuinely enthralling coming-of-age story in its own right. This is where Odin Sphere storytelling really shines. Instead of the usual black and white colors of morality most games paint with, Burgoyne splashing in any shades of grey, Leifthrasir shows the various conflicts and sides, the reason from which each character's actions stem from. A character who might seem like an adversary in one tale, like Mercedes was during Gwendolyn's part, could have their motivations explored in another one by way of avenging a fallen loved one, or, in the case of Mercedes in the third story, proving their capabilities as a leader of a nation and maturing from a frog-shooting child into a woman. Of course, some characters like King Valentine and the Wise Men have malicious intentions, but the leads are surprisingly well balanced even in some of the weaker stories, to the point where it really does feel like the 5 main novels were penned by different authors to show different perspectives while simultaneously telling a small piece of a far more grand story, save for the awkward lines of dialogue scattered throughout all of them.
A baby dragon.
A dragon with a crown.
A dragon's crown. I wonder if they'll name a game after that. Oh, who am I kidding? That'll never happen.
The fourth story involves Oswald the Unlucky Knight, as he goes around killing anything Melvin tells him to, while Melvin tries to convince the Fairy Queen to mass-produce cipher weaponry, the incredibly powerful weapons that the main characters wield, using Oswald's track record as an example of their efficiency. Oswald almost feels like a non-present in his own story, merely witnessing the events play out for the first half. It's not until the second half where it goes into an existential, "what meaning does my life have? Woe is me and my bloodstained past" crisis that's so whiny it wouldn't make its way into a Simple Plan album. In fairness, the ending twist does paint his relationship with Gwendolyn in a slightly better light than the first book does, but while Oswald's insistent that she isn't meant to be a trophy should make him better than the other men who see her as nothing but a reward, or even worse, an object.
You are as precious as that ring.
It doesn't change the fact that the overall game still frames Gwendolyn and her affection as a prize for which one of them has to win.
Then again, this is a vanillaware game, so unfavorable depictions of women and their various relationships are kind of expected with the territory. For example,
"'Twas your duty to dance and console me, remember? So what is keeping you? Show your courtesy and kneel as you did before."
Yes.
Now, do you remember who commands you?
yeah, hard to say that it's meant to show something deeper than, frankly, a troublesome relationship, when said relationship is not even an isolated incident within one of their games.
Not that it's completely devoid of substance. Again, Oswald's realization that he's been used by Melvin helps to better illustrate his devastation of Gwendolyn's actions, and his struggle to find joy, or at the very least, a purpose beyond murdering people in the first book, but it is the weakest of the 5 by far. In contrast, the fifth story is the most superfluous of the bunch, as Melvin and her brother Ingwe are looking to change their fate due to a curse by their mother, and further exploring the world-ending prophecy that's been mentioned in the background of the previous tales. Though it is interesting to be shown the inner thoughts of Velvet during the previous event, there's very little substance to those thoughts, or anything particularly compelling that this story has to offer, which hasn't been delved to in prior parts beyond the aforementioned curse, which itself functions more like an extension of the ongoing prophecies that foreshadowed the coming of Armageddon, which just so happens to be the 6th book to appear once the main 5 are taken care of. There's not much to say about that one in terms of narrative without spoiling it beyond, well, it lives up to its name. There is a 7th book, but we'll talk about that rushed cap-off of an ending to the saga when we get to the gameplay and the problems with unlocking it in the 6th one, namely because its faults lie more with the gameplay than they do with the relatively well-structured story. Odin Sphere certainly knows how to begin an ambitious story, and while its initial intrigue doesn't receive a satisfying payoff come the 7th book's final pages, the tales of the various characters are certainly fine reads. Just a shame that it takes a ton of page flipping to make your way through each one. Both in its enhanced and original incarnation, Odin Sphere is an odd blend of beat-em-up action with 2D Metroidvania-esque backtracking and exploration, where the main characters travel through literal spheres, smacking down foe after foe before fighting a boss at the end of a level. With a total of 5 leading lads and ladies, naturally there are 5 slightly different playstyles that all draw from the same well. The two that share the most common ground are Gwendolyn and Cornelius, due to their ability to rack up hundreds of hits in a short time span, being balanced out with the lower strength compared to some of the later characters, with the former of the two focusing more on launching foes in the air, with multiple blows of the spear and ice variety, while the latter tends to be better suited for fighting on the ground, with an equal ease of chaining together a flurry of electrical spells and skills. These two serve as a solid introduction to the basics revolving around Odin Sphere's combat, only for Mercedes to upend them by being the only character who retains the POW-consumed regular attacks mechanic the original Odin Sphere used. This may be due to them being the only character who is primarily projectile-based rather than close combat, in addition to being capable of flight, the latter of which is particularly useful since enemies tend to pop up in a swarm-like fashion as they surround you from both sides. But a projectile-based character isn't well suited in providing a challenge when most of the bosses and enemies aren't designed when dealing with a fast-moving character that focuses more on long-range attacks than short. She does have some shoot 'em up sections which are a breath of fresh air among the largely repetitive levels, namely since it's one of the few times where a portion of a given level is specifically built around a given character's strength, namely Mercedes' ease of movement in the air, rather than basing traversal on what spell or key you just so happen to be carrying. All in all, a solid character, but one that takes a lot of time to get used to. Oswald bears more of a resemblance to the former two, where one adds slower surge wings, and a berserk mode that involves hitting enemies to build up a meter, then activating it when full, that immensely increases their attack and speed to the mix. The balance between building out the berserk mode through weaker swings by singling out opponents before activating it to crush what few remain in an even more powerful form is certainly novel, but more often than not, you'll forget about this mode outside of boss battles, namely since they take forever to beat, if not actively avoiding the use of it so as not to turn these regular encounters into even more of a cakewalk. It's also a bit annoying that you can't open the menu while in this mode, so eating items to heal or using spells is out of the question for some baffling manner. Not to mention that it can be a bit difficult to activate it in a pinch. It's certainly not as frustrating as using the final character, Velvet. The idea is to keep enemies at bay while striking them from afar due to the character's relative frailty and variety of long-range fire-based skills and regular attacks, but with the amount of enemies that are normally thrown your way on both sides, it's rarely ever possible to strike them with any sort of distance between them and you. Her attacks are sluggish and, pardon the pun, simply aren't as much fun to chain together compared to the former 4. Minor grievances with certain characters aside, it's refreshing to see a somewhat varied set of them that still manages to flow through the same vein as one would expect from the smooth, if simplistic, combat commonly found in Vanillaware's games. Though, come to think of it, doesn't some of this sound familiar? A young woman with a strong devotion to her duty, whose fighting style involves fast but weak strikes? A troubled young man whose destiny is changed thanks to the involvement of a powerful woman that grants him the ability to tap into amazing powers?
So having perused my way through most of Vanillaware's releases up to this point, here's a revelation. Odin Sphere is the foundation for the various characters' backstories and combat styles found in Giroku Legends.
That's certainly not a bad thing, since Giroku Legends is a severely overlooked tetralogy whose various characters' radically different moves and weaponry were still universally easy to pick up and play due to sharing the same base as one another, complemented by a charming set of stories. Beyond its variety and darling scenarios, one of the main reasons that Legends became so enjoyable stemmed from its brevity. Each story could be beaten within 2 hours, give or take a couple of minutes, depending on one's familiarity with the layout of Massive Rebirth's various areas and the basic combat mechanics of that game. Each of Odin Sphere's 5 main tales takes roughly 8 hours, the same time it would take to go through all of Giroku Legends without counting any additional time spent on uncovering the various skills, recipes, and items each of the ones Odin Sphere has to offer. To say it overstays its welcome is a bit of an understatement. It is highly tedious to trek through the largely same levels and defeat the same enemies and even bosses with little variation between them. Speaking of which, the short playtime in Giroku Legends also helped to mask the recycled areas from massive rebirths that each legend explored, mainly by limiting exploration of other territories and challenges until you beat the game itself, making the hidden ending a reward for one's prowess in understanding the combat system, rather than Odin Sphere's confusing, choose to fight a series of bosses with the right characters, or you get the bad ending, that the game doesn't provide enough hints in the 6th story as to which one should be fought against which.
Not to mention that it suffers from a bit of a disconnect between the gameplay and the narrative. All the other books in the saga have a definitive beginning, middle, and end, the only major differences being the player's own experience and choices, i.e. which enemies are defeated with which skills are upgraded, etc., which are largely divorced from the overarching story. Was the 6th book a choose-your-own-adventure novel? Because if so, that seems like a really bizarre way to end this epic saga, to detail the events of the Armageddon, the end of the world, as it's been built up to at this point. It'd be like if Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was a coloring book.
While the focus on beating enemies to proceed from one area to the next might lead one to assume that it plays in a similar manner to Dragon's Crown, the closest design comparison to one of Vanillaware's various video games is Muramasa the Demon Blade and its Vita remake, in that it suffers from a lot of the same backtracking and progression issues, save for the tedium of grinding souls for new blades, being traded in for backtracking to earn extra skills and special items, along with retreading the same handful of levels. That's not to say Leifthrasir doesn't have any of its own muscle to flex. Each of the characters has a pretty extensive skill tree to explore and upgrade via the foes hunt gained from fallen foes, even if some of the abilities are copy and pasted between them instead of seeing a completely fresh set for each one. It's incredibly fun to try out different skills and spells and set up your favorites to link them together for a massive combo, despite the enemies rarely ever putting up a challenge. OSL's bloated length isn't helped by the difficulty being a bit too easy, at least if you're playing the Enhanced Edition on normal. Though there is the option to play it with the original's mechanics, it's kind of, sort of, a complete mess. The character's basic attack tree and the power meter and frequent dissonance makes combat far more tedious than it should be, the leveling system is confusing given how ciphers are designed, and the frustration from the boss fights is turned up to 11 given the aforementioned patience testing overly punishing POW-focused combat. Ambitious as the original may have been, it's an experimental game that doesn't quite hold up when compared to Vanillaware's more recent and polished affairs. It's not a bad inclusion in of itself, on the contrary. It's great to see the original game's mechanics being preserved for a new generation of people to experience an older release with all of the bells and whistles that Leifthrasir has attached to it, in the same vein that it was great to see Metroid Zero Mission include the original Metroid when it was released. However, to be blunt, if you want to enjoy Odin Sphere, you're much better off playing the Enhanced mode, since it cuts out most of the unnecessary fat and frustration from that game. The keyword being most. Bosses and mini-bosses are still a pain to deal with, mostly since what little challenge they present comes from the frequent flood of new enemies that are an utter nuisance to deal with in the earlier levels, not to mention the massive amount of health these bosses possess. On their own, there's very little strategy to taking them out outside of spamming power-based skills and waiting for them to recharge. In addition to the aforementioned length, there's a few other design choices that add to the overall tedium. While there are minor changes in terms of structure, i.e. which rooms come when, and which areas or secrets they connect to or hide respectively, set levels end up lacking any significant variety beyond the playable characters that travel across them, which gets monotonous when you wander through the forest level fighting the same enemies 4 times, regardless of whether their defeat comes from a different playstyle, let alone the time devoted to minor tedious side activities. One of the new additions in Leifthrasir is a rabbit that can be summoned to make food via recipes you find, one at a time, rather than setting up multiple orders at once. In the aforementioned Muramasa and Genroku legends, there was a fullness mechanic that prevented you from eating everything in your inventory, so it made sense that you couldn't constantly stuff down item after item. In Odin Sphere, all food does is heal and increase your maximum health. So while the ability to skip the animations and consume food outside of the kitchen is convenient in its own right, it has its own share of repetition via ordering the same meal even if one has the ingredients for it. Not to mention the new recipes can be unlocked by trying the same food 3 times, thus requiring multiple samples of the same food to see if a new one will be created. On that note, being given the same recipes for alchemy spells via a note just feels like filling out a quota in a given level, not that you really need them to figure them out. The alchemy system isn't exactly a head-scratcher, almost all of them boiling down to using between 1 and 3 of the same items, and doesn't lend itself to many creative combinations like one might have expected given the amount of ingredients one could mix into a given potion.
These might sound like nitpicks, but when you're constantly growing food, mixing potions, sampling new raw materials, and trying out recipes to bolster your HP, the time you spend on them starts to add up. It certainly doesn't amount to a deal breaker, but it does make it feel more flabby, not helped by the amount of unnecessary backtracking.
Take for example, Velvet's turn to try out the forest level. There's a section where you need to shrink down in order to fit through a crack to get to the next section a la Rayman, except the mushroom that allows you to shrink is in a completely different room, thus requiring you to go back to said room to use the mushroom to shrink and pass through. Now there is a checkpoint that lets you move closer to that tiny crack, but there really wasn't any need to make said mushroom in a completely different room than the one players need to go through, mainly since they tend to be reserved for accessing secret areas rather than required for the sake of progression. Necessary to proceed or not, the backtracking tends to be on the tedious side of things, with checkpoints that only slightly alleviate in cutting down on the amount of time given how most levels are structured. This doesn't make Odin Sphere a bad game by any means. Tiresome as it is to go through the largely same levels, the combat has never been more tight in a Vanillaware offering, nor has there ever been as grand an amount of detail in this delicious pie of a presentation. Whatever else can be said about Kamatani's fanservice-filled aesthetics, let alone his unique interpretation of the male form, the rendering of those designs is amazing. The animation is incredibly crisp, complementing the magnificently detailed, multi-layered backgrounds. It's easily Vanillaware's finest looking game to date, repetition be damned. There is the very rare appearance of slowdown when the screen is full of grunts and spells, and by rare I mean I only encountered it once throughout 40 hours of playtime, but the Enhanced Edition doesn't suffer from anywhere near the same amount as the original did. On the sound side, the soundtrack captures the grandiose scale of the story for moments of both the somber and serious kind, while the encore performance from the original cast are as solid as one would expect from a recent Atlas published title, though one minor grievance with the latter is that there's a ton of weird pauses and lines that rush from one sentence to the next with barely a breath in between.
In spite of the adventure containing a substantial amount of repetitive content, Odin Sphere Leifthrasir is very pretty and pretty good overall.
It goes without saying that this is the best version of Odin Sphere available. A genuinely solid game with a fascinating framing that goes on a bit too long thanks to a bit of fat left after boiling the original's ribs. In the words of Journey, it goes on and on and on and on. Strangers waiting. Were it not for Genroku Legend's brevity, lending itself towards a more satisfying experience, and Dragon's Crown's clever adaptation of arcade elements into a modern beat-em-up, this would have been Vanillaware's best outing thus far. As is, it's a solid bronze medal that's worth a look, especially if you haven't given the original a try.
Odin Sphere Leifthrasir earns a 7.5 out of 10. That's all for now, folks. Until next time, game on, my friends.